So I guess yeah. That kind of takes me to the next question, which is, well, how do we kind of begin to carve out our own kind of specific and unique building culture and material culture in in this kind of external pressure that is like global modernism or global cultural homogeneity. Oof. How do we start to take appreciation for what we have here, and in kind of both the material sense and then also the kind of building as a whole,
Building technology.
Yeah. Do you think such a thing is possible? Can we start to develop that here, or is that something that do you think we don't have the capacity to do locally?
I definitely think we have the capacity to do it. The issue is really that and people I've heard this argument before that people talk about, well, why aren't we developing a Caribbean architecture or Caribbean modern architecture or whatever? And in some ways, we have to acknowledge what our history is.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we are not divorced from other traditions, right? There are building traditions in the Caribbean that did not come from the Caribbean. I mean, people who don't know think that they are Caribbean, right? So you think about gingerbread houses and things like that. Those came from somewhere else. There are developments that have been specific to the Caribbean, but that kind of Georgian architecture and so on came from somewhere else. That being said, I mean, I think as the entire Caribbean is all very young in terms of being independent nations, and the trajectory towards developing this national identity, and in this case particularly with regards to architecture, will take a long time. I do think, however, specifically in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we are at an advantage because of Carnival. And we talked about before where Carnival mentality is actually something that could be quite negative in terms of the sense of disposability that it engenders in people. But the creativity of Carnival on an annual ongoing basis is, I think, something that can find its way into building culture. Things like wire bending, for instance, the making of backpacks, wings, and all, there are all manner of things that go on in terms of making Carnival costumes, which have never been thought of as kind of orthodox artistic expression. Right? And I think they are. They most certainly are. So I think that is a sort of a locus from which we could start thinking about methods of making, well, first of all, just methods of making, right? But also methods of thinking about how you would put together an architecture, and also an architecture that is A, rooted in the Caribbean, and then B, also rooted in this climate. Right? So I personally think that is it's from that location that we could possibly move forward in terms of building culture. We are, so I'll give you an example, right? So one of the things that the school in Jamaica wants to do is that they want to get 3D printers. And to my mind, yes, okay, fine, you want to have a 3D printer. It allows you to sort of prototype something really quickly, and you can see, you can build a model and sort of test out something in a design. But in terms of material culture, I think we need to be looking at our own environments, what materials are available, and really doing a lot of research around those materials in order to develop sort of a local
palette almost.
Of materials and materials and methods.
Yes.
Right? Materials and methods of construction. there's a lot of research on and use of bamboo, for instance, in the Far East, in Vietnam, for instance.
Vietnam,
Doing tremendous things
Thailand,
with bamboo.
Indonesia.
Right? We have some bamboo here, we don't have a lot of bamboo here, but and there are also historical examples in terms of what the native peoples used to make buildings.
Yeah, sort of thatching and those sorts of techniques.
Exactly. Those things have sort of died out. Nobody does that anymore because we all want sort of modern materials in the buildings that we make. Right? That's not really sustainable. So I do think there's the possibility of that happening. It requires a lot of research, and I think it's something that should be pursued in the schools of architecture that exist in the Caribbean. I mean, I've always said that that's the one thing, if I got involved in a school, that I would like to do, which is to really to head up a class that researched materials. I mean, it could just be dry leaves, twigs, stones, whatever else it is. You know, how could you use it imaginatively to create materials that both indigenous and also sustainable.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that you see popping up, you know, globally.
Yeah.
You know, there's schools of architecture in Europe that focus heavily on materials, that are learning kind of almost building.
But they are also focusing on materials that are native to those environments.
Yes,
right?
but even materials or techniques that maybe, for instance, there's like building structures, for instance, in mud or mud brick. You get but I mean, that's not necessarily indigenous or native to, so there's that curiosity there. But for some reason, we haven't done a lot of that, you know, within the Caribbean. And I mean,
but those are methods that have been used here in the past. I mean,
yes.
I grew up in a house that was built it was raised on a sort of a platform. But the walls were actually made out of a combination of mud and concrete, right? It was an old cotton station in St. Augustine. So, I mean, those are not materials that are
foreign
methods.
Yeah.
Well, they're foreign now because nobody knows about them anymore, right? They are quite foreign. So there's the issue is really, I think, the industrialization of the supply of materials for construction allows them to actually be low cost, and people then gravitate to those materials because they're low cost.
Yes.
And they're also less labor intensive.
And yes, labor intensive.
Are we ever going to get back to that point where the focus is put mostly on the sustainability of the material, the fact that it is generated locally, as opposed to just simply focusing on the cost and the ease of construction? I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah. I think there's also maybe even a potential for a sort of interdisciplinary perspective, in the sense that there's actually there's a kind of a body of engineering knowledge that we have in the Caribbean that's actually quite impressive, I think.
Yeah.
In comparison with other kind of regions around the world that, you know, maybe gained independence around a similar time. But for some reason, maybe there's sort of an overlap that can start to happen there, you know, borrowing that engineering knowledge or that expertise to kind of investigate materials that are local. But then, I guess, again, that hasn't quite happened yet. So do you think that's a possibility? Do you think, I mean, what do you think of that, essentially?
It is a possibility. I know at the university they have investigated, so there's a sort of primacy of these horizontal core clay blocks, right? It's the cheapest block that you can buy on the market. It is terrible for seismic resistivity, right? Because you can't reinforce it vertically. And reinforcing it horizontally makes no difference. I do know that they have done research at the university in terms of how do you take that block, which is the cheapest block, and use it, but also make the construction seismically resistive. And it involves sort of skinning the two sides of the block with BRC and a fairly thick render covering, and having structural elements that go through it. and you create this very rigid wall, and you literally can create quite a rigid structure with that method. So yes, I mean, obviously with some creativity and the use of research, you can actually move things forward.
Yeah.
Right. One of the most amazing experiences I had was to going to the Abel clay factory, which is fairly automated process. I mean, it's a huge factory. It's right next to the pit where they actually extract the clay from, and the entire factory is run by about 12 people. And they just, it just churns out tons and tons of blocks. So we went there actually during the pandemic, and you walk into the factory and there's just piles of blocks standing up, and we asked, well, what's going on? They said, well, we can't turn the factory off because it takes so much
energy to turn it back on.
Right? So they kept it at the lowest rate of production, but they just kept producing blocks. So it's in that context that, how do you fight against a material that is so prevalent, so cheap? You really have to be motivated way beyond that in order to explore what is possible in terms of other materials.
Yeah, and you have to have the access to the capital to do so.
Yes.
Which obviously, those are two very large challenges that come up against.